State Senator Josh Mclaurin, you have announced you're running for lieutenant governor. Why do you want to be Georgia's next lieutenant governor?
Well, we need leaders who have energy. We need leaders who are honest and courageous and tell the truth. And I think one of the biggest problems we have right now in a chaotic Trump administration, we don't have the state leadership that we need to be standing up to some of that chaos and calling it like it is and asking for a different course. So the tariffs are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, they're a great example of how, I went to the port of Savannah to launch and to announce. And there was a shipping container that happened to, or a freighter that came by the second that I was announcing. And what a great example of the tangible impact these tariffs are having. The longshoremen who work at the port, the truckers who drive cargo to retail stores, retail employees and workers, and then consumers who pay higher prices because of tariffs. This is something that directly affects every Georgian. But our state leaders are silent on this, and even worse, they're sucking up to Trump. I mean, they're passing America First license plate bills and resolutions that are trying to cater to him and to try to win his endorsement in a primary. So I think the number one thing that voters are looking for right now amid all this uncertainty and chaos is, are we going to have people who are just going to right the ship, who are going to act and speak normally about public policy and try to ensure quality of life instead of careening into this sort of cult-like mentality that Trump has tried to cultivate? There's
a lot to follow up on what you just laid out here.
Sure.
I want to start with this. Let's talk about the tariffs. We're taping this conversation on Monday.
Right.
Earlier this morning, the Trump administration announced what could be characterized as a truce in the trade war between China and the United States. Just to put some facts on the table
Sure.
here. Earlier this morning, the United States dropped tariffs on China from 145% to 30%, and in turn China dropped their tariffs on American goods to 10%. You indicated you're worried about tariffs, you're worried about the cost of living. Do you think this latest evolution in the trade and tariff conversation is a good thing for the United States? Is this a win by the Trump administration?
I mean, when a chaos agent acts in a slightly less chaotic way, is that a win? I mean, the 30% tariff is still a historic tariff that's higher than I think almost any other that Trump is trying to impose. That's a tax. We're going to feel it across the board, even 10%. I mean, even some of these tariffs that he's put on, I guess, every country, but he's held them in abeyance. That is a cost that the businesses who are increasing their prices will be passing along to consumers. So starting at a crazy number like 140 doesn't make it any better. When you land at a number like 10, it is still a trade war that serves nothing but Trump's ego. And so I think this is one of the things that voters are really fed up with. People are exhausted by partisan politics. People are sick of the fighting. But at the same time, people are sick of somebody's ego or authoritarian impulses being what drives all of our public policy. Nobody wants a country that serves the whims of one man, or at least a vanishingly small percentage of voters want that. And so
I hate to cut you off, but
yeah.
I just want to be clear.
Sure.
You mentioned authoritarian impulses.
Yeah,
That's a heavy, weighty thing to say.
It is.
Do you think President Donald Trump is an authoritarian leader?
I think that he'd like to be. I think that we have a long and storied tradition of democracy in this country that prevents him from doing the things that he would want to do. Look, the president of El Salvador came to the White House, and Trump said to him, I would like to send homegrowns to the anti-terror prison in El Salvador. Now that's a place where 80, 90 guys packed in a cell, basic human rights are not being protected there. And he wants to send US citizens there. I mean, that's something that he said. I think his press secretary even said that, he would do it if it were legal, right? That he's kind of looking at those options. So, that's crazy. Disappearing people off the streets, plainclothes officers picking people up. And we're not just talking about undocumented people. We're not just talking about green card holders. There was a US citizen who was a resident of Georgia, who I believe was picked up in Florida, and a Florida judge, couldn't release that person immediately, even though he had his birth certificate, because there were some draconian laws in Florida about cooperating with ICE, cooperating with the federal government. So, this is a time when we need to be paying attention to what Trump is trying to tell us about who he is. We should believe him when he says that he wants to do these things. And nobody wants the climate of uncertainty that it creates. Look, even if you don't know somebody who personally gets abducted, it creates uncertainty about, are your workers going to be able to come to work? Is the economy going to function the same way that it always has been? Are we going to keep progressing and advancing quality of life in Georgia and the whole country under circumstances like this where there's just so much chaos? And so I know that, I'm running for a state office, right? I'm running to be the president of the Senate in Georgia, which is the guy with the gavel who stands at the top and, manages the Senate's business. But I think what people would agree with me on here in terms of the uncertainty of all this is that tone matters. The tone that leaders set really matters. It matters whether you wake up every day and you look at your phone thinking, what's the latest chaotic thing that happened? Am I going to have to worry about the purchase order I made, overseas because of tariffs or anything else? It matters to have that uncertainty. And so I think having leaders who get it, who understand this is just too chaotic and we need to return to some sense of normalcy and growing the economy in the way that we're used to, and not this kind of crazy bend off to the side. I think that's really what Georgians are looking for in their state government as well.
Let me ask you one more question on this point, and then I want to talk about some kind of brass tacks issues as well, but it's worth lingering on this point for a moment, particularly because you've been a part of your state elected office holder, your state legislator. You've also been a part of the national political conversation, particularly over the last few years. A moment ago you said people are tired of the partisanship and the partisan fighting. You also just spent a lot of time talking about your concerns about what you described as President Trump's authoritarian impulses.
Right.
Those seem to be two things, kind of opposite sides of the coin. How do you balance those two?
That's a great question. So I used to use my Twitter account a lot before it was X. I used to tweet at political opponents. And I was humbled one day when one of my friends across the aisle came up to me and said, you tweeted at me once in the last few months. Are we going to be able to be friends? Are we going to be able to have a relationship? And I can admit mistakes. I mean, I had kind of a coming around in the last few years to this idea that we're actually not served by going to social media with our fights, by trying to inflame debates and treat our opponents as enemies. I wouldn't say I was ever the worst at that, but I definitely did my fair share of inflaming that conversation from time to time. And what I realized was we're not going to survive this era, this political era of polarization, if our first instinct is to just go to the internet and say bad things about our opponents or try to criticize our opponents in a way that's really inflammatory. Now you have to be principled. You have to stand up for what you believe in, and everything I just said to you, I believe. I think that Trump is one of the biggest threats to American democracy that we've ever seen in this lifetime, and our way of life, for all the reasons we've been talking about. And so I still have to say that, but I don't have to say that in a way where I'm personally, super angry and worked up and trying to, undermine my friends and colleagues who I work with in the Capitol.
Is that a tough needle to thread? Because you and I both know there are going to be people who hear you say that about President Trump, and they're going to find that very inflammatory.
They may, they may, but I think part of it is having a good sense of humor, and part of it is valuing people. The reason that I criticize President Trump in this way is because I care about small businesses. I care about whether the economy can keep functioning the way that people expect it to keep growing. I care about whether there are people on the streets who are just getting abducted by plainclothes officers and don't know whether they can go out in their communities. It's empathy for those people that drives the public policy platform that I and a lot of my colleagues share. And the word empathy, it's interesting. Elon Musk recently has called empathy, which I believe we try to teach all our kindergartners how to care about other people and share and have empathy. But Elon Musk has called empathy basically a disease or a cancer to Western civilization. That's like the biggest threat to Western civilization. And it's like, come on, like who talks like that? I think that's kind of the thing that gets me worked up right now is, it's not just a disagreement over policy, right? I think we are all hungry for a time when we can just disagree over policy and not make it super personal and super polarized. But to be in an era where somebody who is running the federal government's efficiency operation or DOGE or whatever it is, for him to have such authority in our government and to say that empathy is the problem, I'm kind of at a loss for words. And so to your point about how do you balance principled opposition with being able to live in one community, we have to fight for the values that matter, and empathy matters, and community matters. And so, if I get painted as a partisan because I'm standing up for my principles and trying to do it with a good sense of humor and a spirit of community, I don't know what else to do. I think that, look, there's going to be a group of people who support Trump who will never agree with me, who will never vote for me. And I can accept that, just to be cynical and polling wise, there's probably a good 30 to 40% of people who are just going to support Trump no matter what. But the rest of the country has to make up its mind. You know, there are a lot of moderate Republicans who I'm friends with, who I think are sort of, they're tolerant of the Trump moment, but you know, they don't like a lot of the excesses. My campaign is trying to speak to those people, say, look, I know I'm a Democrat. I know that some of my positions are going to be different than yours, and in a normal environment we might have policy disagreements. But let's look beyond that. Let's look at just the level of chaos that we're experiencing right now, the level of instability and lack of empathy that is coming from our leaders in Washington, and then the silence that state Republican leaders have shown in response to these failures. And I think that counsels for a righting of the ship in a year like 2026, a more moderate approach that balances out what has been happening in Washington.
You're teeing up something I'm curious to ask you and curious for your thoughts, and this is a question we've asked a lot of Democrats in 2025 and in 2024, and probably predecessors of mine in years past here in Georgia too. There has not been, you're running for lieutenant governor right now.
That's right.
There has not been a lieutenant governor from the Democratic Party in Georgia in almost 20 years. How do you flip the script?
So, again, I think that this conversation we're having about returning to normalcy, returning to some sense of balance and order, and you know, not waking up in the morning and thinking, I have to check my phone to see what the latest crazy thing is, that is one pitch that we can make. Because, you know, I think the Republican Party right now is almost like it's like a computer that, you know, there's like a blue screen, you know, problem. There's some sort of error message that the party is unfortunately unable to control this chaos, right, from within. Republicans in DC, Republicans at the state level, just based on the influences at work in their party, are unable to respond to this moment. And so you almost have to kind of unplug the computer and plug it back in. There are a lot of fiscal conservatives and people who I think want to vote Republican, who want to keep voting Republican in the future, but are having a really hard time towing the party line right now because the party has become all about Trump. And so I think what voting for Democrats in Georgia gives a lot of people the opportunity to do is to reset that feedback loop on the Republican Party to make it work better again. I mean, we have a two-party system. You know, arguably we should have more parties, but that's not the way that the system works. And we have this adversarial system where the parties have to balance each other. And so the only way to fix a party that's not going to correct itself is to allow the other party a chance to prove, you know, we can govern also.
What do you say to Republicans who would say the state system is working just fine, and look at Governor Brian Kemp and his approval ratings that are quite high? People in Georgia like Republican leadership in the
I would
state.
submit to you that the reason that Governor Kemp's approval rating is at 60% is because he was one of the only ones in the country who was perceived as standing up to Trump. When Trump said, I want you to find, you know, Brad Raffensperger, I want you to find 11,000 votes, and then there were a series of Georgia state leaders at that time who did that one basic thing, right? They said, we're not going to overturn an election just because you ask us to. I think that garnered him a lot of support from people who saw that exercise of courage. Now, again, there's a lot more that I think Kemp could do to be courageous, more than just that one thing. But I think a lot of people saw that and said, that's what we want from our leadership. When one person wants to be a tyrant and goes too far, we want the rest of the political community to say, hey, that's too much. You need to rein it back in and put a limit on that. So, you know, my response would be that Georgia Republicans' policies don't poll that well. A 6-week abortion ban is not popular. Refusing to expand Medicaid is not popular. There are other fiscally non-conservative things I could describe to you, even just from this past session. We've got infrastructure needs throughout the state where we need to make 20, 30-year or more investments in our roads and bridges so that we can move freight. Well, Governor Kemp has decided to use a lot of our surplus money to pay for that instead of using bonds, to bond it out at favorable rates so that those generations can all pay for the infrastructure as they use it. That's not a fiscally conservative decision to use our one-time money to do that, but that's something that he chose to do. So there's a lot of ideas that Democrats can bring to the table that I think would be more popular, would be more in line with what people are looking for, to restore reproductive rights, to save rural hospitals that are closing by the day because they can't afford their indigent care, and that's something that expanding Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act would help with, to rewrite the funding formula for public schools, which we haven't updated in decades, and to put a poverty poverty weighed in to give our failing schools a chance. There's so many things, and we don't have the time, unfortunately, on the Georgia vote to cover all of them.
But we are going to find a little bit of time right now,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
every one of these conversations we have with candidates, we always want to make sure, and it usually happens at this point in the conversation sometimes, because there's a lot to talk about, but it's worth pressing the brakes a little bit, because I want to give this question to you straight on and give you a chance to answer it. There's a lot going on in our state and in our country. As you gear up for your campaign, you've announced you're in this race now. From where you sit, what is the number one problem facing Georgia right now?
The number one problem is that this economy doesn't work for everybody. And there are people who work 2 to 3 jobs just to have the basic quality of life that our parents and grandparents enjoyed in a lot of cases. The idea of home ownership. It was difficult for millennials in the last 10, 15 years. I can speak to that personally, being one. But for a lot of people who are Gen Z or just getting out of school, almost laughable to think that they're going to have, unless they go into one of a number of rarefied, high-end, white-collar jobs, harder for them to imagine homeownership than almost ever before. And so this growing inequality in our state and our country, the fact that billionaires and oligarchs are writing the tax code, writing the rules for themselves, and again, you look at who the richest person in the world is, and that number keeps going up, and the difference keeps being more dramatic. It's contributing to this sense that there's a lot of hopelessness among Gen Z voters. People ask me, how do you get the youth vote out? And I say, well, first we've got to admit that everything is stacked against them. The deck is stacked. They're worried about climate change. They don't see meaningful movement among the world's leaders on climate change at a rate that will prevent the worst impacts of climate change from happening. The economy. So I think that we've got to be clear-eyed about how we are basically returning to a Gilded Age from 100 years ago, where the robber barons, figured out a way to hack the country and take as much as they could while leaving very little for the rest of everybody. And we know how that turned out in terms of the economic woes of that time. So we've got to be able to address directly, not just $250, $500 rebates. That sounds nice. It's a sprinkle a little money on people if you're Governor Kemp during tax season. We have to do a more fundamental realignment of the economy so that it really does work for everybody.
How do you do it?
Unions are a great way to do it. Unions are responsible for the 5-day work week, the quality of life that we enjoy in the workplace. I mean, enjoy, maybe a strong word, but it could be a lot worse. And if you look at conditions in other countries, at manufacturing conditions and sweatshops, we really have something unique in America, that we value the experience of the working person. That's because of unions. We have, in Georgia, it's a right-to-work state, right? So it's kind of an anti-union climate here to begin with, but there's a lot we could do to make the environment more friendly for unions. What that would do is allow working people to balance out their power with the big corporations that kind of run everything. You hear Governor Kemp and folks say, well, we're the #1 state to do business. Well, we're the #1 state for big business, for sure. But for small businesses, for whom the tax code is trickier, the paperwork is trickier, for whom shocks like these tariffs affect more, it is not the same business climate for small businesses. And a lot of that is because when we're forced to choose between the little guy and the big guy, all too often we have been choosing the big guy.
I want to end here, because there's always a lot we can talk about.
Sure.
But I do want to end here. You pointed to the economy as your #1 issue. But we spent a lot of time talking about other stuff, too.
Sure.
So I want to give you a chance. Underneath the economy as your #1 concern, what do you stack in that 2 or 3 position in a state, in a country where there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people are worried about?
Sure. We want to restore reproductive rights. I mean, Georgia has taken us back to this draconian 6-week ban. A lot of women don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks just because of the way that the biology works. And so, we have a de facto abortion ban. We have bills in the state legislature right now that got a hearing this past session. There was a bill in the House to essentially have a fetal personhood bill that would make the abortion deadline 0 weeks, right? To completely ban abortion. So
now that did not pass.
It did not pass, but I'm saying you've got forces in the state capitol that are nipping at the heels of the majority, and over time, the majority has started to bend to the far-right pressure. I'll give you a great example. There was a bill when I was a freshman in 2019 in the House that didn't make it out of committee. You kind of mentioned, well, it didn't make it out of committee. And this was a bill to criminalize teachers, to say that media technicians and librarians could be hit with a misdemeanor if they didn't scrub, quote, obscenity from all of the volumes in their library or on online databases. Now, what that might mean in some cases, if a parent, say, objects to LGBTQ equality, they might take a book that depicts LGBTQ people positively and complain and say this is obscene. This is the type of culture war that some Republicans have been pushing. Well, that bill didn't make it out of committee 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The Senate just passed that bill, that same bill this year. And Brian Kemp, he did not originally want to pass the constitutional carry, permitless carry bill. In 2022, he did pass it, but years before that, the furthest right members of the legislature had been pushing for it and had been ignored. So I've been there long enough now. This is my 7th year in the legislature. You can track over time how these impulses are moving the legislature further and further right. Voters do not want this. I mean, 60, 70% plus of voters want the most basic common sense legislation, like safe storage, right? Which is a bill that Republicans and Democrats got behind in the House, but the Republican Senate stripped it. Or restoring reproductive rights back up to at least to where it was. We had a 20-week rule before, and basically there's all these ways that we can right the ship and make government more moderate again. But the Republicans are not in a position to be able to do it. And so we have to be able to elect new leadership to try that out. And here's what my pitch to moderate Republicans, the elusive Kemp Warnock voters, right? Give it a shot. Put some Democrats in charge statewide and you'll see. We are not elevating the most extreme voices. If anything, Democrats are really good about looking at our far left flank and saying, hey, we're not defunding the police. We're not going to do half the things that the far left is asking for because we take a different approach to governing than the Republican Party does. The Republican Party right now is listening to those extreme influences. So let's right the ship. Let's elect some new leadership in 2026. That is the pitch.
This is the thing when you say one last question, because the answer always pops up, a follow-up, and I do want to end with this, but it's worth pointing out. Again, it's a topic that we've seen come up in the early days of the 2026 Senate race already. We saw it in 2024 a lot, and you alluded to it. You talked about these so-called culture war issues. You referenced a bill that focused on potentially LGBTQ folks and materials in school settings.
Yeah.
The issue of LGBTQ folks, and particularly trans athletes in girls and women's sports, has been at the forefront of the conversation for a while now. SB 1, the very first bill out of the Senate, was focused on this issue, and it was a Republican-sponsored bill that would, and it was passed, would keep trans girls, folks who identify as trans girls and women, out of girls and women's sports in Georgia. Where do you stand on this issue?
So I voted no on that bill. I want to be clear, this is a Republican bill. This is a Republican bill that's bringing up the issue of trans people. You hear a lot, why are Democrats or, the left upset? The Republicans are obsessed with this issue. The right is obsessed with this issue. There were more bills than I could count on trans issues. In fact, I even made a kind of a joking reference from the Senate when I gave a speech, like, how many of these bills do you guys need to put it on your mail that you send out for campaigns? Do you need 3 or 4 or 5? They actually did pass that many trans bills. So I would challenge voters with this thought experiment. If you elect Democrats statewide, how many bills on trans issues do you think you're going to get? Probably not many. I mean, we are interested in doing sort of a statewide anti-discrimination bill that applies to everybody, right? So that you just can't be discriminated against for just living your life. And I think that's what most Americans want. Americans want us not to be bullies. They don't want people in power, people with resources, to spend all their time targeting and going after a small minority of people just to make their lives miserable. And if you look at the number of trans people in the state that these bills are affecting, Republicans couldn't even come up with an example of a trans athlete in Georgia. They were asked multiple times in committee and on the floor, how many athletes would this affect? And they didn't know of any. Right? So this just proves the point that Republicans are passing multiple of these bills to try to target unknown minorities of people, small numbers of people, to essentially bully them. We already have local rules. We have the GHSA, all the local sports authorities have rules on this and already deal with it. We should not be elevating culture wars to the state level to beat up on people for politics so that we can try to be on the more popular side of an issue. So that's my answer to that. Is I am opposed to efforts to try to single out and bully folks that are redundant, that we already have local regulations to take care of, and And I think I would challenge people to think about who's really bringing this topic to the forefront.
I think that's a good place to end it. State Senator Josh Mclaurin, thank you.
Thank you, Zach. It's been great to be here.